So today, I'm gonna take this off. We're doing a forum on autism and doing that kind of as a continuation of the disability series that Allison started last week. And so I'm Doria. I use he for pronouns, and I'm an autistic adult and a parent of autistic children, and also a neuroscientist. So my training is in cognitive and neural systems, specifically sensory processing. And so I'm going to mostly be talking today from my personal perspective. I asked for and did not receive consent from my children to talk about them at all this morning. So from my own perspective, and we don't have enough time for me to get all science here, y'all. And I'm doing this together with Linnea.
Yeah, hi, I'm Linnea. Hopefully some or most of you know me. I use they, them pronouns, and I am also an autistic adult, and I will also be talking from my experience.
Yeah, so hopefully I can, there we go. So Linnea, you could go ahead and
Yeah. So why are we talking about this? Why should we care? Yeah, is it on?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, so why should we care about autism? Autistic people are everywhere. It's more common than one might think, and many people are getting diagnosed as adults. More children are getting diagnosed, and sometimes people freak out about that, like there's more autism. I think we're just better at identifying it than we used to be, and that it is not a problem that there are more of us, that we are wonderful, and it is fine that we are here. Yeah, and also I would argue that autism and disability more generally are an aspect of identity and an axis of oppression in our society, which means that autism belongs in our conversations about justice. Autism belongs in our conversations about identity and all of that stuff that we are working on talking about. And listening to and accommodating autistic people is good practice for being aware of needs and preferences that might differ from what we've been taught is standard. Also questioning the status quo, which we are learning we need to do in many, many ways as we talk about white supremacy culture. And there are ways that autism intersects with that, and ways that autism is different, but also valid and important to talk about. And also just broadly noticing who is included and excluded in our society, and where there are inequalities that we need to work on fixing.
okay. So I'm going to start out with just a little bit of like terminology. Autism started out as a thing that was being studied by white male psychiatrists mostly. And so a lot of the language that's been built up about autism is really deficit oriented. It's very, you're not like me, and that's a problem. And so in the last 10, 15, 20 years, adult autistic people have kind of taken control of this and started a movement of sort of like redefining our language and claiming it as our own, and making it empowering and something that we can hold on to as part of our identity. So part of that is that most adult autistic people prefer identity first language. So that's like an autistic person instead of a person with autism, because we think of autism as something that's part of who we are. We're born autistic and we die autistic, and it's not like a disease that we can't sort of catch or have. A lot of the language that I'm going to talk about a little bit here is around the notion of functional labels. So autism is a really big space. If you're confused by it, that's fair. If you're confused by seeing us up here calling ourselves autistic, that's fair. And people have tried to make sense out of how big that space is. by trying to make these functional labels, high functioning. But those are really hurtful. So, you know, if I hear somebody say, I have a grandson with autism, but he's really high functioning. You know, in my heart, I hear somebody say, my grandson has this thing, but it's okay because he's smart and he can contribute to society. No input. Joel, do you want to play around with that while I talk about functional labels? And so there are three things about functional labels. One is the notion that, you know, if somebody says to me, oh, you must be really high functioning, then it kind of minimizes the challenges that I do experience, which some of them are kind of comparable and exhausting. And so while I appreciate that you think that I'm smart and I'm good with my words and things like that, I also want like my challenges to be acknowledged too. Another tricky thing about functional labels is that if there are high functioning people, then how does that feel to other people? The other people who are, is that low functioning? Nobody says that for a reason, because you don't say to a person like you're low functioning. Because that's not something that we would say. And then sort of the third thing about functional labels is that it sort of gives us this idea that autism is a gradient instead of a spectrum. So a gradient is something that goes from like less autistic to like very autistic or more autistic, kind of quirky to like really sad, you know? And that's not actually what autism is. So there are a couple of different analogies for autism. One is like an ice cream sundae bar. If you go to the froyo shop and they're like, you know, dozens of things. You could kind of think of an holistic, which would be a neurotypical person taking one scoop down the line. And then an autistic person might have 4 scoops of Oreos and no scoops of that and no scoops of that and 2 scoops of Reese's Cups, you know? It's like with all of the variabilities that people have, an autistic person has some things that are turned way up and some things that are turned way down. And, you know, here we have, you know, social differences, interests, repetitions, sensory sensitivities, emotional regulation, perception, executive function, other, you know, and so some of those are off the charts and some of them aren't even on the charts, and every person is different. So it's a gradient. The last thing I want to say about language is just around a little history lesson about Hans Asperger. So Asperger's is not a diagnosis. Going back, Asperger was a pediatrician who was active in Vienna between about 1930 to about 1980. And he was one of the first people to systematically document and categorize and describe the behaviors that go into this autism state, which is great. Most of his work was written in German. And so it wasn't really very widely known until the 80s and the 90s. Thanks, Joel. You can just be like my tapper. Yeah. But in the 80s and 90s, his work was found, it was translated. And then in 1994, Asperger's became a diagnosis in our diagnostic manual. It was removed as a diagnosis in 2013 here in the United States and in 2019 in Europe. So just recently, it's fair if this is news to you. The trick about Asperger is that initially we thought that he wasn't like colluding with the Nazi regime, but a lot of really great historical work has been done recently that's found that he was the kind of person who navigated Nazism in order to protect himself and to advance his career. And he did this at the cost of children who he knowingly sent to be euthanized. And so, you know, unfortunately, Asperger's work is really, really deeply entrenched in Nazi eugenics. This notion that some of these kids who are weird and different they're smart, they can contribute to society, they're worthy of living. And some of these kids aren't. So we're gonna just, I don't know. So we don't use Asperger's syndrome anymore for a really good reason. Please don't use Asperger's as a nice way to say high functioning, because it has all the same problems with saying high functioning. There are some people who were diagnosed as Asperger's in that 10-year span, and that's their identity. And if they say that to you, if they say, I'm Asperger, that's who I am, you know, respect that, but know kind of the history that goes with it.
Thank you. Yeah, so what is autism? We've been kind of talking around it and how to talk about it, but what is autism? Autism is a disability. Disability is not a dirty word. And specifically, autism is a disability that affects social communication, behavior, information processing, and sensory processing, which is to say that it affects just about everything in my life. But those are some ways to divvy up the way it affects my life. People are born autistic. Some of you may have heard at some point that maybe vaccines cause autism, or you can become autistic after you get certain vaccines. That's not true. We're born autistic. It's just a lot of the symptoms show up around the time that a lot of kids get their vaccines. Autistic children grow up to become autistic adults. Autism is often talked about as if it's only children, and that is not true. This also happens to some other forms of neurodivergence, including ADHD. That is also not just about children, but specifically autistic people can be very infantilized. People sometimes talk about a mental age. Like, oh, well, she's 28, but really her mental age is that she's 9. And that's very destructive and infantilizing and bad. And autistic adults are real adults. Many of us are capable of making our own decisions, doing things that most adults do, and even people who might not be able to, live independently are still adults when they are over the age of 18. And one of the aspects of being an adult is that we can have, sexual thoughts, sexual desires, and that often is really left out of the conversation. And it's assumed that, oh, well, they're disabled, they don't think about that, and that's not true in most cases. Autistic adults commonly live with conditions like depression, anxiety, eating disorders, underemployment or unemployment, and we don't know if autism is the risk factor or living in an ableist society while autistic is the risk factor, right? We don't know, we don't have good data on what it looks like to be autistic in a society that is built for us, that accepts us. We don't have data on that. We don't know what it looks like to be an autistic adult and not be traumatized. We don't know. And Doria can talk or not talk as she wants about any of those things that have or have not affected her. But I have lived with depression and anxiety for a very long time. I had an eating disorder when I was 14. This is just kind of what happens to us. This is how our lives go. And they don't have to, right? Autism is likely not the risk factor. The risk factor is likely living in our society while autistic.
Yeah, I live with that whole list. What can we all do? Make that a little bit better for people, knowing that there are children growing up in this community and adults in this community who, can use some special care. So the first thing I'm going to talk about a little bit is social communication, and it's sometimes like sort of the obvious one, but it's also the place where people can help us a lot. So small talk. Casual topics very often feel really pointless to us. We don't need to talk about the weather because it's kind of obvious, what the weather is. Like, there's just a lot of like small topics that, it's hard for us to latch onto and feel excited about talking about. And it's really hard for us to know how much is too much. I think anybody who's talked to me knows that like either I'm not there in the conversation or I'm like dominating the conversation. It's really hard to know how much is too much sometimes. So that balance of like, how eager am I, or how like cool am I, like that kind of like tweaking that comes naturally to a lot of people can be hard for autistic people. So how can you help? Don't take it personally. If this communication is not easy, or if it's not going in a direction that seems fair, sometimes I know Lene and I would prefer honestly just to not talk. Unless there's a topic that's worth talking about, we can just be. That's okay. Sometimes you want to just like get on board with it being one-sided. If that's okay with you, that's fine. Or be really clear about what you need. If there's something that you need to talk about, say, that's really interesting, but I really need to talk about this too, and then we're like, absolutely, of course we'll do that. Eye contact. So some of us can and some of us can't. Most of us don't want to. And so like if we're not looking at you in the face, that's just because it's actually physically hard to do. If you have like two magnets that are like the same polarity and you like try to push them together, that's kind of like what it feels like when I try and make eye contact with people sometimes. So again, don't take that personally. That's just how I am. Sometimes I really like to have like sort of side-by-side conversations while doing something else, doing dishes or setting up communion or doing some kind of project. That's really my favorite way of talking with people. And also some of us use the sort of like over the shoulder trick or the forehead trick. So if it seems like we're making eye contact with you, but not really, know that that's the trick that we're using. So body language. Both Lene and I are like foot standers, swayers, tappers. Like we move our bodies a lot. And sometimes there are nonverbal cues that autistic people use that we don't naturally think about, or we don't naturally interpret. And so if you're bored or you're late and you're trying to tell us with your like, we might not get it. Please just say, I'm late, I gotta go. We struggle sometimes with getting the right cadence and volume. I know maybe right now I'm talking really too fast and maybe too loud, but I'm kind of nervous. And I spend a lot of time thinking about how loud am I, how fast am I speaking. I think about my eyebrows and I think about my like face shape. Am I like engaged enough? Am I too engaged? You don't want to be like creepy. I spend a lot of time thinking about that stuff. So if you see my face sort of like looking weird, it might be because I like slipped and I'm not paying attention to it anymore, which might be a great sign. I'm really engaged in our conversation and I'm not thinking about masking. Or maybe, I'm not like right on top of it. I'm pretty good at masking though, so I'm usually pretty on top of it. I'm trying. Just ask rather than assuming how we're experiencing.
Yeah, so one aspect of autistic behavior is stimming, which is short for self-stimulation. That is not a euphemism. It's just about how to get the sensory input that we want and need and crave. And there are stims that we do when we are happy or excited. There are stims that we do when we're angry or sad or upset or trying to keep ourselves in control. So there's an ode to the stim up there. I'm not sure how great the font is for all of you, so I'm gonna read it. H stims, I stim to, bounce and wiggle, twist a lock, hold tight to that calming rock, fiddle and fold, squint and spin, squeeze and then begin again. Shoes too big so toes can move, wiggly legs that find their groove. Tom Sawyer pockets with fidgets galore, quiet hands are such a bore. Yeah, so stimming includes a lot of repetitive movement. There's echolalia, which is the want or need to repeat a sound over and over, which might be a word or phrase, or it might not have meaningful content. It might just be a noise. There are lots of unusual sitting and standing positions. I hate sitting with both feet on the floor. Worst thing. Yeah, so I twist myself up in all sorts of positions. And Doria does too. Also standing, especially during the prayers when there's a little bit less like going on in terms of auditory and visual stimulation, I am always on one foot. That's how I handle that. I also sometimes rock side to side, especially if I'm kind of bored. Fidgeting with my hair is the biggest one for me. But there are fidget toys. I also knit often. If I don't have something else to do with my hands, then I need to keep paying attention. And that means I am paying attention, not that I'm zoned out. Doodling is much the same for other people. Rocking back and forth can often be a soothing thing, but flapping, arm flapping is kind of one of those kind of stereotypical autistic things, but it's also real. And it's often a very happy expression. And yeah, the biggest thing about stimming is just don't apply neurotypical expectations to neurodivergent bodies. There are types of quote unquote treatment for autism that try to get people to not stim in order to pass as neurotypical. And that is really destructive, really messes with our ability to keep ourselves calm and to express our emotions. And it's really sad that people do that. And quiet hands is a big part of that. Quiet hands, don't apply that expectation. Sometimes stimming can be dangerous, whether someone is really overwhelmed and finds comfort in banging their head against a wall or something like that, or sometimes with children, they might not know that something is dangerous. And so in those sort of situations, it's good to redirect someone to find if there's another stim that can meet the same need, but in a way that's safer. And I've heard about, like, especially autistic parents raising autistic children, that they have sometimes divided stims up into 3 categories. So there's the category of this isn't safe, we need to find something else that you can do instead. Then there's the category of shared space, which is, it's okay if you want to do that, but you can't do that in the room with me, so one of us needs to move because that's too loud or too distracting or whatever. And then everything else is in the you do you category. And I really wish that that had been kind of some categorization that my parents had used when I was a kid. Me playing with my hair was one of my mom's biggest pet peeves when I was growing up. And I started doing it when I was about 8, when I got over the chewing on my hair stage. And I have done it ever since I was 8. And until I got my autism diagnosis, every time my mom saw me doing it, she told me to stop. And yeah, that's a thing that's sad in my past, because it's really a way for me to stay engaged. It's a way for me to keep focusing. It's a way for me to, you know, regulate my emotions. And yeah, I wish that that had been something that was fine.
I have a fun story about flapping. I learned that was weird when I was really young, so I don't really do that. But I was out at a bar with a bunch of autistic moms and moms of autistic kids, and it was like one of those moments where you feel seen and you feel heard, and you feel like embraced by people. And like there was a moment where I just flapped, And they were like, you are so autistic. And it was such a gorgeous moment in my life.
The hour.
Yeah.
I like that pun. I've seen it before and I still like it.
So, as a neuroscientist, it's hard for me to not like get geeky as we start talking about some of this like information processing stuff. But one thing that is not visible outside of the brain a lot of times is how information is processed. There's sort of a top level concept called cognitive coherence that applies to part of a lot of different pieces of autism, because cognitive coherence is pretty weak for autistic folks. That is, we have lots of things that come into our brain, you know, visual, tactile, lots of sensory stuff, auditory stuff. And then we also have our expectations and our stored knowledge, our learning. We have all kinds of context things that are stored in our brain. And our brain is just teraflops of wondrous amazing that puts all of that together into a big picture. And then does something about it. Says something, writes something, does a behavior, an action, or something like that. And for autistic people, a lot of times one of these, or one or more of the inputs is slower or faster. And a lot of times one of the outputs is slower or faster. And you can see, you know, this is a really simple picture actually, that it's a really complicated space. And so that's where you get your diversity, because, you know, I might have a really fast visual input for that. I don't. Kinesthetic. So I'm a kinesthetic learner. I have to like work with something in order to take that information in. If somebody is talking to me like this, I can't learn that. And so, but it might be different for somebody else. So
Swipe.
just swipe.
Well, right there up. All that screen over to the left.
Okay.
All of your.
I think you need a full like click it.
Guys, I'm not taking your information and making it. This is an example of like taking information and making something coherent and then doing something with it. And you know, like this is something that's really tricky for a lot of us. A lot of us have really built up ways of hiding it. So if I don't understand what you're saying to me, I'll say something like, could you write that down for me? Or yeah, just a second, let me think about that. You know, there are all kinds of like little things that we do to like let our brains catch up and then like figure out what we're gonna do. And that's a place that's really stressful for us when we're trying to like spend the time to like let everything sink in and like figure it all out and then like respond. That slow processing time is really tricky, especially, you know, folks like us, like, you know, we're intelligent people. And so there's sort of like an expectation that we should like click along like smart people do. And that's not always the case. So listen for our cues when it's clear that we're not keeping up with you. Don't rush us, because that just like adds to this feeling of panic that lives inside of us a lot of the time. And that dysregulation, that feeling of panic makes everything worse. And then in a community like this, it's really important to connect people with the types of tasks that work for them. You know, and to kind of like listen when somebody gives a cue of, I'm not sure that, you know, I'm the person to do X, Y, and Z. That's a kind of soft disclosure that we might make if we're uncomfortable with trying to keep up with a particular kind of information. Oh, was I gonna do this, or you were gonna do this?
Yeah. So this is another aspect of behavior. did these slides get moved around?
I think they might have gotten moved around a little bit.
Okay, we'll roll with it. Yeah, so, back to the topic of behavior, this slide is about special interests, which you may have heard of. And if you see that light switch, diagram that says how my brain works, utterly obsessed and uninterested. So kind of like Doria was talking about earlier with, some things being turned way up and some things being turned way down. And this is one of the reasons that small talk is hard, because when I am interested in something, I am very interested in it. I tend to know a lot about it, especially if I've been interested in it for a while. And then other things, I just don't care. And so I don't know much about it. And it can be hard to have good conversations with people when they know a lot about 2 or 3 things and very little about anything else. And that's also how their interest works. So yeah, special interests are incredibly joyful. And when I'm really interested in something, I can often talk about it for a long time. And sometimes I've heard that this comes across as like pompous grandstanding. And really, like, trying to share my special interest with someone is a very vulnerable thing, and also a way that I try to share what makes me happy. That I am really joyful about this thing. It brings me a lot of joy, and so I want to share that. And so if you choose to interpret that as me being really arrogant and self-absorbed, that doesn't further the relationship. Also, like, diving into a special interest can help us regulate our emotions, help us stay safe, help us feel safe, and it can be really transformative. And so some ways of kind of interacting with autistic folks when it comes to a special interest, don't yuck my yum. If something is really interesting or joyful to me, you don't need to tell me that it's boring to you, or, if you are bored by it, I can stop talking about it, talk to someone else, but like, you don't need to make me feel bad about it. This is interesting to me. You don't like. Right. And especially with children, don't infantilize, like, oh, it's so cute that you know so much about. Shut up. And yeah, so even if you're bored, especially with adults, like you can express, this is not interesting to me, can we talk about something else? That's okay. But like, can you be kind about it? Can you not say, that's a ridiculous thing to be interested in,
I promise to not talk about my children, but the cartoon is about one of my children.
Somebody else drew it.
Yeah.
Oh, was I gonna do this
I think you're gonna do that one. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, so information processing, Doria already talked about the ways that we might process information more quickly or more slowly. But there are other aspects of information processing. Executive functioning, I don't know about all of you, I feel like that concept has been everywhere in the corners of the internet that I inhabit in the past couple of years, and I had not heard of it 5 years ago. So I don't know if the rest of you have also experienced that kind of, wow, this term is suddenly everywhere, or if that's just I got diagnosed and suddenly was in different spaces. But I feel like executive functioning sometimes gets watered down to like, can you accomplish tasks on a timeline? And that's part of it, but that diagram has a lot of different pieces of it. So executive functioning includes things like decision-making, flexible thinking, working memory, self-monitoring, planning, prioritizing, task initiation, organization, impulse control, emotional control. It's a lot of different things that are all controlled by kind of the same part of the brain. And so executive functioning can be really, really hard for autistic folks, also folks with ADHD. Also at times when you're really depressed, it can be hard to do executive functioning. So there are a number of reasons why this might be hard. And often societally, struggles with executive functioning are read as like laziness or procrastination, in kind of a like, oh, you're choosing not to do the thing in front of you, and you just need to choose to do it. And that is not an accurate or helpful way to read the situation. Often autistic adults, especially those of us who have had some help in the past, have figured out some ways that we manage our executive function. When I struggle with task initiation, I tend to put on music, and that helps. So there's things like that, but I have definitely like left a restaurant because I could not pick a dish to order, and it was that stressful. So yeah, so there's stuff like that. So if someone tries to tell you that they struggle with something in this realm, like be aware of that, listen to that, believe them. Also, people might need help. They might know what they need, especially if you're dealing with an adult. And so if someone says, I need some time, or I'm not the best person for this task or whatever, like believe those sorts of cues. But also if you're dealing with a child, or with an adult who hasn't, been diagnosed or hasn't had help or whatever, you might need to come up with some things. Would it be easier if I left you alone? Would it be easier if I started this with you? Would it be easier if we had some music? Would it be easier if we went to another room? And yeah, help connect people with tasks that they're well suited to, and believe people when they say they're not suited to something.
A lot of times body doubling helps a lot to get things rolling. Where somebody's not able to do it, you can say, would it help if I just sat here on my phone with you while you do it?
Yeah,
Amazing how much that
wrote
makes
my
difference.
first cover letter while on Skype with someone.
Yeah, just like knowing that somebody is there with the expectation that you're doing a thing.
Yes.
They don't have to do anything,
don't-
just knowing that they're there and they're expecting that you're doing a thing helps you do the thing.
Yes. Yes.
The last thing I want to talk about is sensory processing. This can be a really, really confusing space. Not only for people outside of autism, but also for people inside of autism, because our sensory seeking and avoiding can shift day by day, depending on the general emotional state that we're in, depending on the demands that we have, depending on what's being asked of us. So it's important to know that there is seeking and avoiding, very broadly speaking. So in going back to that sort of analogy where some things are turned way up and some things are turned way down, the same is true with all of the senses. So some people might have their auditory turned way up and have no tolerance for any sort of like sound above a whisper. We call that hyperacusis. But some people might have their auditory turned way down and they just want like to sit and like be awash in like rock concert stuff all the time. Because that they like are desiring that kind of input. The same is true for like all of the other senses too. Some people like to be touched, hugged, squeezed, rolled up in a burrito, pounded on the back. And some people it's like, why don't you stay over there? I'll be over here. Smells, I think usually smells are sensory avoidance spaces. I've met some people who really like sniffing weird things, but mostly people are really sensitive to smells. Just when I needed a crutch. It was fingers across. I'm not an apple person, so
Another one.
that way. Okay. Oh, I did it. Yeah, eating. Special notes on eating. A lot of autistic people are often classed as picky eaters, often like clinically picky eaters to the point where they can't nourish themselves. And that's not because like we're babies or we want to be annoying or we don't know or care about our health. None of that is true. But a lot of times it's sensory. A lot of times it's just the feeling of that food in our mouth, in our throat, in our stomachs. And that that can be really overwhelming and dysregulating. And so especially children will be kind of hard to read sometimes in terms of like what they like to eat and what they don't like to eat. Like, oh, I like broccoli, but only microwave broccoli, and only broccoli microwaved in a bag for 4.5 minutes, not 4 minutes, 5 minutes, you know, and so it's not about the broccoli. It's about like the texture and the feel of the broccoli. So how can you help? Believe people when they talk about sensory processing differences. I am a sensory scientist. I am a neuroscientist, and I am telling you that this is real, how this information is processed. We can look at MRI images, and be comfortable with the mismatch. Seeing a person one day being comfortable inside the sanctuary, and then another day not. And be comfortable with variability. This is a space where things add up, they build up, it's cumulative. And so I might have had a really chill day on Saturday and I had a lot of expectations. I sat by the fire with my dog, and now I'm here and I'm able to deal with this whole mix of people and all of the sounds and the sights and the movement, and I'm able to do that. The next week, I might have just had too much going on, might have been crazy at my house in the morning. Somebody might have been screaming at me at 5:30 in the morning. I don't know, but I'm not able to handle any of the sensory load of being in this space. So,
Before you go, one more thing. I just wanted, if you're gonna sing in the choir, I hesitate to invite anybody away from this conversation, but we're gonna just run through our song.
that was the last piece that I was gonna talk on. We did close it to questions so that we could get through all of that, wanting to just like share our experience and educate. But know that we're always willing to talk about this. If you have questions for us.
So this is one of the things you are interested in.
Yeah. I went and got a PhD on this. Yeah, so. Yeah. Probably.
Thank you so much.
We did it.
Good job, you two.